A quiet veteran and his aging war dog disappeared into a frozen forest, leaving behind only rumors and laughter. Locals mocked the strange half-dome cabin he built with measured hands, saying no man could outthink winter, no curve could defy the wind, and no soldier could outrun the scars he carried home. They were certain the snow would claim him, just another broken soul swallowed by the cold. But winter did not come gently. It came as a white wall of fury, a blizzard that erased roads, crushed shelters, and turned the forest into a grave of silence. When the storm finally broke the town's pride, frightened figures followed a thin trail of smoke through the frozen dark, and found the only door still standing. Inside waited a man they had misjudged, and a dog who had learned, long ago, how to survive when everything else collapses. That night, the blizzard learned a hard truth. It had chosen the wrong cabin to test. Before we begin, if this story moves you, comment Amen and subscribe for more stories of courage, loyalty, and quiet heroes. Winter arrived early in Frostpine Forest, sealing the trees in ice and pressing the sky low, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Jack Sullivan parked his aging pickup at the edge of the timberline and shut off the engine, letting the silence rush in like cold water. The town behind him, its diner lights, its curious stares, its well-meaning but exhausting small talk might as well have been on another continent. Frostpine was different. Here, the air didn't chatter. It waited. Jack stepped out into the snow, boots crunching with a measured rhythm that came from years of drilling movements into muscle memory, and beside him jumped Duke, a 7-year-old German shepherd with a thick sable coat, a scar notched through his left ear, and eyes that never stopped scanning. Duke moved with the quiet confidence of an animal that had learned survival was not about speed, but awareness. He paused, nose lifted, reading the wind like a language Jack himself could no longer fully hear. Jack followed Duke's gaze and felt it too, the way the cold curled instead of cutting straight, the way the breeze didn't rush, but circled, testing. This place would do. Jack was tall in a worn, angular way, 6 feet of lean muscle stretched thin by years of tension rather than comfort. His face was deeply lined for a man just past 40, the kind of lines that came not from age, but from squinting into sunlit deserts and storm-heavy skies. A short, untrimmed beard shadowed his jaw, threaded with early gray, and his brown hair was always just long enough to look unkempt, as though grooming had fallen low on his list of priorities, somewhere between deployment and coming home. He wore a brown jacket faded at the elbows, and beneath it a red and black plaid shirt he never replaced because it felt familiar, grounding. Jack didn't believe in omens, but he trusted patterns, and patterns were what had saved his life more than once. "This is it," he murmured, more to the wind than to Duke. "We build here." Duke flicked an ear and sat, tail sweeping a shallow arc in the snow as if approving the choice. Jack smiled faintly. It didn't reach his eyes. He hadn't come to Frostpine chasing peace in the poetic sense people like to talk about. Peace was a luxury word. He came chasing quiet enough that the echoes in his head might finally lose their grip. The war had ended years ago, but it still followed him in fragments. The sound of wind funneled between concrete walls, the way pressure changed seconds before structures failed, the memory of corners collapsing inward like broken jaws. Jack had been an Army combat engineer, trained not only to build but to predict failure. He had learned physics the hard way, with chalkboards replaced by field manuals and lectures replaced by alarms. Corners, his instructor once said, tapping a diagram, are where forces argue. Curves let them pass. That lesson had stayed with Jack long after others blurred together. Back in town, people had smiled politely when he spoke of building something different. The hardware clerk, Sarah Collins, had tilted her head with a practiced gentleness that suggested concern more than curiosity. Sarah was in her mid-30s, tall and slender with pale skin that burned easily in summer and freckles that bloomed across her cheeks in winter. Her blonde hair was always tied back in a low ponytail, practical and unadorned, and her blue eyes held a softness that came from someone who listened more than she spoke. "A dome?" she'd asked, scanning his list of supplies. Like, round? Jack had nodded, already bracing for the reaction. Sarah hadn't laughed. She'd just frowned slightly, worry lining her brow. "Winters get rough out there," she said. "Make sure it's strong." He'd thanked her and left before the conversation could drift toward concern, pity, or worse, sympathy. Tom Bennett had been less subtle. Tom was a stocky man in his late 50s, broad-shouldered with a thick gray mustache and a laugh that filled rooms whether invited or not. He'd spent his life in Frostpine and wore it like armor, flannel shirts stretched over a solid frame, hands perpetually smelling of diesel and wood smoke. Tom had watched Jack load lumber one afternoon and snorted. "You planning to live in a soup bowl, soldier?" he'd called out. "Snow'll bury you by January." Jack hadn't responded. Duke had stepped forward, hackles lifting just enough to make the point without crossing a line. Jack preferred it that way. Words had a habit of escalating. Silence didn't. Now, standing in the clearing, Jack dropped his pack and unrolled a set of weathered sketches, corners softened by years of folding and unfolding. Duke padded closer, sniffing the paper before settling beside him. The drawings weren't pretty. They were functional arcs measured to the inch, load paths marked in thick pencil, notes scribbled in margins from a time when sleep had been optional and survival wasn't. Jack ran a gloved finger along a curved line and felt something steady in his chest, a rare sensation these days. "We're not fighting the wind," he said quietly. "We're letting it go." Duke's ears twitched. The dog had been with him long enough to recognize that tone, the one Jack used when he was certain, when fear had been measured and filed away rather than allowed to run loose. Duke himself bore the marks of shared history, a healed limp from shrapnel damage, a chest broadened by years of work, a calm that came only from seeing chaos up close and surviving it. He wasn't aggressive, he was deliberate, the kind of dog that didn't bark unless it mattered. Jack began pacing the clearing, counting steps, visualizing the structure rising not as walls, but as a continuous shell. His mind slipped into that familiar state where anxiety narrowed into focus, where memories lined up and became tools rather than threats. He imagined snow piling against the sides and sliding away, imagined wind rushing over the curve without finding a grip. For the first time in months, his hands stopped shaking. He planted the first stake just as the light began to fade, the sky bruising into purples and steel blues. Duke watched the forest line, body angled slightly toward the deeper woods, as if listening to something Jack couldn't yet hear. "You feel it too," Jack said. Duke huffed softly, tail thumping once against the ground. Whatever Frostpine held, storms, judgment, or solitude, they would meet it head-on, not with defiance, but with design. As night crept in, Jack lit a small fire and sat beside it, shoulders hunched against the cold, Duke pressed warm against his leg. The forest whispered, branches ticking under ice, wind circling as if curious. Jack stared into the flames and thought, not for the first time, that survival wasn't about being the strongest thing in the storm. It was about being the smartest shape. He reached down and scratched Duke behind the ear, right where the scar broke the fur. "We'll build something the winter can't argue with," he said. Duke leaned into the touch, eyes half-lidded, already guarding a home that didn't yet exist. Above them, unseen clouds gathered, and the wind shifted, as if taking note. The first stones went down before sunrise, when the forest still wore its blue-gray hush and Frostpine breathed in slow, frozen pulses. Jack Sullivan worked without music, without distraction, because noise, any unnecessary noise, made his thoughts scatter. He cleared snow with methodical sweeps, stacked rounded fieldstones by hand, selecting each one not for beauty, but for how it settled under pressure. Years ago, in a wind-battered forward base overseas, a poorly chosen foundation stone had shifted during a storm and collapsed a temporary shelter, trapping 2 men inside. Jack had dug until his fingers bled. He did not forget lessons written in blood. Duke circled the clearing as Jack worked, paws silent on crusted snow, his sable coat dark against the white ground. The dog's body carried a quiet tension, not fear but readiness, head lifting whenever the wind changed pitch. Duke was 7, past the reckless energy of youth, his muzzle dusted with gray, his chest broad and powerful. When he stopped and stared into the trees, Jack paused too. They trusted each other that way, without words, without argument. By mid-morning, the stone ring began to take shape, a low circular foundation pressed into the earth like a promise. Jack knelt, checked level with a battered tool older than most of the town's jokes, and nodded once. That was when the laughter came. It drifted in first, thin and curious, then grew louder as boots crunched along the frozen trail that cut near the clearing. A pair of hunters emerged between the pines, rifles slung casually over heavy jackets. They were local men, thick-bodied and red-cheeked from cold and habit, faces carved by years of weather rather than reflection. One of them slowed, eyes widening as he took in the curved stone line. "What in God's name is that?" he asked, amusement bubbling through his breath. "Looks like he's building a well without water." Jack didn't look up. He set another stone, tested it, adjusted. Duke shifted, placing himself subtly between Jack and the strangers, posture relaxed but unmistakably alert. The hunters laughed and moved on, the sound trailing behind them like loose snow shaken from a branch. An hour later, a pickup rattled to a stop near the tree line. Tom Bennett climbed out, hands shoved into the pockets of his heavy coat, mustache stiff with frost. Tom was broad and square, a man built like the houses he trusted. Straight lines, solid corners, nothing fancy. He had worked timber most of his life, lost a brother to a mill accident decades earlier, and since then had believed firmly that anything unfamiliar was dangerous. He watched Jack bend over the stones and barked a laugh. "Well, I'll be damned," Tom called. "It really is a bowl. You planning to live in it or just feed the deer?" Jack straightened slowly. He didn't face Tom right away. His shoulders rose and fell once, steadying. Duke stepped forward. Standing tall, ears forward, amber eyes locked on Tom with a gaze that didn't threaten, but warned. The laughter faltered, just enough. "Easy there," Tom said, raising one hand. "Just joking." Jack finally turned, his face unreadable, eyes tired rather than angry. "Jokes land better when they don't come with assumptions," he said quietly. His voice carried no challenge, only fact. Tom snorted, embarrassed by the attention of his own discomfort. "You'll see," he muttered. "Snow don't care about clever shapes." He climbed back into his truck and drove off, tires spinning briefly on the ice. Jack watched until the sound faded. Duke remained still, then glanced up at Jack as if checking whether the threat social, not physical, had passed. Jack exhaled. "You're fine," he told the dog. "You did fine." The day wore on, and the pattern repeated. A snowmobiler slowed to stare. A woman walking her dog paused, whispered to her companion, shook her head. Laughter came in different flavors, curious, dismissive, uncomfortable, but it all carried the same message. You don't belong. Jack felt it press against him like wind against an unfinished wall. He reminded himself why he'd chosen this place, why he'd chosen silence over comfort. He bent the first wooden ribs that afternoon, steaming the timber until it softened, then easing it into curved form with clamps and patience. Each rib flexed like a bow under tension, resisting before settling. Jack's hands shook at first, not from cold, but from memory. He remembered the sound of metal screaming under pressure, remembered corners tearing free when the wind found something to grab. He slowed his breathing until the tremor eased. Duke lay nearby, chin on paws, watching with the seriousness of a sentry. When Jack finished the first rib and set it into place, Duke rose and inspected it, nose brushing the wood. Jack almost laughed. Inspection approved? Duke huffed softly and sat, tail thumping once. Late in the afternoon, Sarah Collins arrived on snowshoes, a small pack slung over her shoulder. She moved carefully, deliberately, as though she never fully trusted winter not to betray her. Sarah was tall and slim, her blonde hair tucked beneath a wool cap, pale skin pinked by cold. She stopped at the edge of the clearing, uncertainty flickering across her face. "I didn't know if you'd want company," she said, voice gentle, "but I brought coffee." Jack nodded, surprised by the warmth that spread through his chest. "That's appreciated." She handed him a thermos and glanced at the curved frame rising from the stone ring. "They're talking," she admitted. Not cruelly. Mostly confused. Jack took a sip, eyes closing briefly as the heat steadied him. "Confusion is cheaper than understanding," he said. Sarah smiled faintly. "That looks intentional," she said, choosing her words with care. Jack met her gaze. "It is." She didn't press further. After a moment she turned to Duke, crouched slightly, and let him sniff her glove before scratching his chest. Duke accepted the attention with dignified tolerance. "He's older than he looks," Sarah said. "So are you," Jack replied before thinking. Sarah laughed softly, not offended. "Fair." She stayed only a few minutes, long enough to remind Jack that not all eyes carried judgment, then left as quietly as she'd come. As dusk settled, the laughter faded, replaced by the creak of trees and the low sigh of wind moving through branches. Jack stepped back from the structure in progress, shoulders aching, fingers raw. The foundation ring was complete. 3 curved ribs stood anchored, pale arcs against darkening sky. It wasn't much to look at yet, but Jack felt something settle inside him, something stubborn and solid. Duke rose and pressed against his leg, a living weight grounding him. Jack rested a hand on the dog's neck. "Let them laugh," he murmured. "Wind doesn't." The forest answered with a low, circling breath, as if listening. Snow began to fall again, light but persistent, coating stones and wood alike, softening edges. Jack gathered his tools and sat beside the small fire he'd built, watching flakes drift through the glow. The laughter from town felt far away now, thin and brittle compared to the quiet resolve taking shape beneath the snow. Tomorrow he would bend more ribs. Tomorrow the dome would rise higher. For now it was enough to sit with Duke and let the forest bear witness. Night settled fully over Frost Pine Forest, not crashing down but lowering itself inch by inch, until the trees stood like dark witnesses around Jack's clearing. The fire burned low and steady, its heat modest but dependable, the kind Jack trusted. Snow whispered as it fell, grains tapping against wood and stone, and above it all the wind moved in slow circles, never striking straight, always testing. Jack Sullivan sat with his back against a half-set timber rib, knees drawn up, a thick wool blanket around his shoulders. Duke lay at his feet, the German shepherd's large body curved protectively, his breathing deep and even, though one ear remained tilted toward the forest. Jack pulled a weathered notebook from his pack, its cover cracked and darkened with age, corners softened by years of handling. This notebook had crossed oceans with him. It smelled faintly of oil, smoke, and old paper. He opened it carefully, as if the pages inside might still be fragile with memory. The first page showed a sketch of a rectangular shelter, red X's slashed through its corners. Jack stared at it longer than necessary. He remembered the night that drawing had been born, crouched inside a tent overseas while wind screamed like an animal trying to get in. The structure had failed where the walls met, pressure concentrating at the angles until the material tore apart. He had felt the ground shift, heard shouting swallowed by noise, and then the terrible quiet after. Corners failed. Corners always failed first. He turned the page. Diagrams followed arrows showing wind flow, curves redirecting force, notes written in sharp, compact handwriting that came from someone who had learned to conserve space and time. Jack's fingers traced the equations, not because he needed to relearn them, but because touching them reminded him why he trusted them. Drag coefficients, pressure gradients, load distribution. Physics had no opinion. It didn't laugh. It didn't care if a man was tired or broken. It simply obeyed rules. Duke shifted, resting his chin against Jack's boot, warm breath fogging the leather. Jack looked down at him and smiled faintly. "You remember tents?" he said quietly. Duke's eyes opened, dark and reflective, as if they held more history than most people in town would ever guess. Duke had been 3 when Jack first met him, lean and sharp-eyed, still clumsy with his own strength. He'd learned quickly. Too quickly. Jack turned another page and felt the familiar tightening in his chest. A photograph slipped free and fluttered onto his knee. It showed a younger Jack, clean-shaven, eyes harder, standing beside another soldier, a man named Ethan Miller. Ethan had been tall and narrow, with sharp cheekbones and a perpetual half-smile that masked his impatience. He'd trusted corners because corners were familiar. He'd been inside the shelter when it failed. Jack closed his eyes and inhaled until the memory loosened its grip. "Corners are hooks," Jack murmured to Duke, voice low and steady. "They give the wind something to grab." Duke huffed softly, a sound halfway between agreement and sleep. Jack tapped the page where a dome structure was sketched in careful arcs. "A hemisphere," he continued, half joking, half teaching. "Smooth surface. Continuous curve. Wind hits, splits, slides. No arguments." Duke's tail thumped once against the ground. Jack chuckled quietly, the sound surprising even himself. "That's your signature, huh?" he said. "Approval by breathing." The wind shifted outside the clearing, circling faster now, brushing the curved ribs with a sound like fingers on glass. Jack froze, listening. His body reacted before his thoughts did, shoulders tensing, pulse quickening. For a moment Frostpine vanished, replaced by sand and steel. Duke lifted his head instantly, pressing closer, grounding him with solid weight. Jack reached down and rested his hand on the dog's broad neck, fingers sinking into thick fur. "It's just wind," he said, more to himself than to Duke. "Different war." He forced himself to breathe with the dog's rhythm, slow and deliberate. The wind passed. Jack exhaled. He flipped further into the notebook, finding calculations scribbled alongside coffee stains and dirt smears. He'd once shared these pages with a civilian engineer during deployment, an older man named Hassan Rahim. Hassan had been slender, stooped, his beard white and uneven, eyes bright with relentless curiosity. He'd survived too many storms to believe in luck. Hassan had drawn curves in the sand with a stick and said simply, "Force hates being redirected. It loses interest." Jack had laughed then. He wasn't laughing now. He remembered Hassan's village, later reduced to rubble when a square-walled building failed under pressure. The curved well nearby had remained intact. That image had burned itself into Jack's memory, sharper than any metal. He closed the notebook slowly and set it beside him, as if the knowledge inside had been spoken aloud and no longer needed ink. Duke shifted again, settling his weight against Jack's shin. The dog's scarred ear twitched. Jack glanced toward the tree line. "You hear it?" he asked. Duke's ears angled forward, nose lifting. There was something different in the air tonight, subtle, not yet dangerous, but unsettled. Jack didn't label it fear. He labeled it data. "We'll reinforce the lower ribs tomorrow," Jack said, planning aloud. "Add cross-bracing along the base ring. Keep the center of mass low." Duke yawned, pink tongue flashing briefly. Jack smirked. "I know. Boring." He stared into the fire again, watching embers glow and fade. Fire, unlike wind, behaved predictably when respected. He thought of town laughter, of Tom Bennett's square certainty, of the way Sarah Collins had studied the structure with concern rather than ridicule. Sarah's face floated briefly into his mind, her pale skin flushed from cold, her careful eyes. She reminded Jack of someone who learned by watching, not judging. That mattered more than she probably realized. Snow thickened, softening the forest's edges. Jack rose, muscles protesting, and checked the bindings on the ribs, hands methodical. Each knot was deliberate, each angle measured. This wasn't stubbornness, it was preparation. Duke followed him, moving carefully between stones, never stepping where Jack hadn't already tested. "You know," Jack said as he worked, People think survival is about strength. He tightened a rope and leaned back to test it. But strength breaks. Design adapts. Duke tilted his head as if considering the philosophy. Jack finished his inspection and sank back down beside the fire. Fatigue washed over him, heavy but earned. He wrapped the blanket tighter and rested his head against the curved timber. The shape cradled him instead of pressing into his spine. He hadn't noticed that until now. Duke curled closer, warmth seeping through layers. Jack's eyelids drooped, but his mind remained alert, cataloging sounds, patterns, pressures. Before sleep claimed him, he whispered, "We'll let the storm decide who's right." Duke's breathing deepened, steady and sure. Above them, unseen, clouds continued their slow assembly, and the wind traced the curves of an unfinished shelter as if memorizing it. Morning broke brittle and bright over Frostpine Forest, the kind of winter light that sharpened edges and made every sound feel closer than it was. Jack Sullivan worked above shoulder height now, fitting the upper ribs of the dome into place with deliberate care, boots braced wide on a ladder he'd anchored twice despite knowing it was stable. The structure had begun to reveal itself, an unbroken arc rising from the stone ring, wood bending into purpose rather than defiance. Duke patrolled below, a steady circuit around the footprint, nose sweeping low, eyes lifting often to Jack's hands. At 7, the German shepherd moved with the confidence of an animal who knew the cost of inattention. His sable coat was thick against the cold, darker along the spine, lighter at the flanks, and the old scar through his left ear split the fur like a reminder that vigilance was earned. Jack felt the wind shift while tightening a joint, not as a gust, but as a pressure change, a subtle tightening in the air that made his shoulders tense. He paused, tested the beam again, then reached for a clamp. That was when the timber slid. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a whisper of movement, wood easing against glove, but Jack's body reacted faster than his mind. The beam tipped, its weight committing, gravity making its argument. Duke saw it before Jack finished turning. The dog launched forward, powerful hind legs driving him into Jack's thigh and hip, a controlled collision that knocked Jack sideways off the ladder's line without toppling him entirely. The beam struck where Jack's chest had been a heartbeat earlier, slamming into packed snow with a thud that sent vibration up through the stones. Jack stumbled, caught himself on a rib, and dropped to one knee. Duke skidded to a stop, claws scraping, then spun back, hackles raised, placing himself squarely between Jack and the fallen timber as if the wood might try again. Jack's breath came in short bursts. He stared at the beam, then at Duke, then laughed, one sharp, disbelieving sound that broke into something close to a sob. He grabbed Duke by the thick fur at the neck and pulled him close, forehead pressed to the dog's skull. "You idiot," Jack muttered, voice shaking. "I didn't pay you yet and you're already taking hero assignments." Duke snorted softly, warm breath puffing against Jack's collar, eyes steady, untroubled. The dog's body leaned into Jack's grip, solid and unapologetic, like a shield that knew its job and didn't need applause. Jack stayed there longer than necessary, letting the adrenaline drain, letting his hands stop trembling. He checked Duke quickly, legs, chest, shoulders, finding no injury beyond a dusting of snow on fur. Only then did Jack rise, slower now, more careful. He reset the beam with a different approach, adding a temporary brace, muttering calculations under his breath about torque and leverage. Below, Duke resumed his circuit, but closer this time, eyes flicking up with each movement Jack made. The near miss traveled fast. By midday, Sarah Collins arrived again, her snowshoes leaving neat ovals behind her. She wore a long olive coat cinched at the waist, making her tall, slender frame seem even more delicate against the winter. Her blonde hair had escaped its cap in pale strands, catching the light. Her skin was fair, lips pinked from cold. Sarah's blue eyes took in the fallen beam, the new brace, the way Jack's movements had slowed into caution. "I heard a crack," she said gently, concern sharpening her voice. Jack nodded. "Misjudged friction. Corrected it." Sarah's gaze dropped to Duke, who sat beside Jack now, chest out, as if posing. She crouched, offering a gloved hand. Duke sniffed, then allowed a brief scratch under the chin. "He saved you," she said, not as a question. Jack didn't argue. "He does that." Sarah smiled small, sincere. "Good dog," she murmured. Duke's tail thumped once. Later, Tom Bennett trudged up, curiosity overcoming pride. He stopped short when he saw the dented snow and the rebraced joint. Tom's broad face tightened. His mustache twitched. "Heard you had a scare," he said, voice rougher than before. Tom was built like a timber post-thick neck, squared shoulders, and his eyes carried the fatigue of a man who had learned loss early and built skepticism to survive it. Jack wiped his hands on his jacket. "Handled." Tom glanced at Duke, then away. "That dog's got sense," he muttered. It was as close to praise as Jack expected. Tom didn't stay long. The afternoon settled back into work and quiet. Jack reinforced the upper ribs, added cross ties, and recalculated loads, his focus sharpened by the reminder that mistakes didn't announce themselves politely. Duke stayed close, sometimes lying directly beneath Jack's ladder, sometimes pacing, sometimes freezing to stare into the trees when the wind circled just so. Near dusk, Duke's posture changed, ears pinned forward, tail stiff, a low sound vibrating in his chest. Jack followed his line of sight and saw movement at the tree line. A young gray wolf stepped into view, lean and cautious, ribs faintly visible beneath winter fur. It watched them with intelligent detachment, yellow eyes assessing. Duke stood tall but did not advance, body aligned with Jack, a living barrier. The wolf lingered, then melted back into the forest, the message delivered without conflict. Jack exhaled slowly. "You guard more than wood," he said. "You guard the perimeter." Duke sat, satisfied. Night came early, and with it a deeper cold. Jack lit the fire and checked Duke's paws by habit, pressing gently, watching for flinches. The dog accepted the inspection with stoic patience. As Jack wrapped his own hands around a mug, he noticed a tremor he couldn't quite explain, not fear, not cold, but the residue of almost. He stared at the dome's rising curve, now scarred with the memory of a near failure corrected. The structure looked stronger for it. Duke settled beside him, weight anchoring Jack to the present. "You're my sentinel," Jack said quietly. Duke's eyes half closed, but his ears stayed tuned to the night. Snow began again, softening the day's marks. Jack leaned back against the rib, feeling the curve cradle him. Somewhere deep in his chest, something loosened a trust, not in luck, but in partnership. If the storm came, it would meet not a man alone, but a man watched over by 4 steady legs and a will that did not sleep. The forest went quiet in a way Jack Sullivan had learned to respect, a quiet that did not mean peace, but preparation, as if the land itself had drawn a long breath and was deciding when to let it out. Frostpine's trees stood rigid beneath a sky that had lost its depth, the blue thinning to a pale, sickly wash that made distances hard to judge. Jack paused mid-task, gloved hand resting against a curved rib he'd just tightened, and felt the pressure change before he could explain it. Not a gust, not cold, something subtler, heavier, pressing inward. Duke froze below him, the German shepherd's ears lifting high, eyes narrowing toward the open corridor between the trees where wind usually spoke first. At 7, Duke had learned to read the world as a sequence of tells, a shift in scent, a delay in sound, a stillness that didn't belong. He didn't bark. He never did when it mattered most. Jack climbed down and stood beside him, both facing the same slice of forest. "You feel it," Jack said quietly. Duke's tail lowered, muscles coiling. They waited. Snow fell in slow, fat flakes that seemed to hover before landing, as if gravity had momentarily forgotten its job. Jack glanced at the small aneroid barometer clipped to his pack strap, an old habit he'd kept from field work overseas. The needle had dropped since morning, too fast, too clean. Pressure didn't do that in winter without a reason. He tapped the glass once. The needle trembled, then settled lower. Jack swallowed. He didn't need prophecy. He trusted instruments and instincts, and both were speaking in the same language. The sound of snowshoes approached from the trail, steady and practiced. Emily Carter emerged between the pines, her posture upright, her pace efficient. Emily was a forest ranger in her early 40s, tall and athletic with a runner's build, shoulders squared by years of carrying packs through backcountry. Her dark hair was braided tight down her back, practical and severe, and her skin bore the honest weathering of someone who spent more time outside than under roofs. Emily's eyes were sharp and observant, the kind that cataloged details without dramatizing them. She stopped a respectful distance from the structure, gaze flicking from the curved ribs to the stone base to the sky. "I was hoping I wouldn't have to come," she said, voice even. "But the signs aren't good." Jack nodded once. "Pressure's dropping." Emily's mouth tightened. "We're seeing it too. Satellite data shows a compact system pulling moisture hard from the west, colliding with cold air faster than forecast. That usually means heavy snow, but the wind profiles worry me." She looked up again, squinting. "It's not behaving." Duke stepped half a pace forward, body aligned with Jack, ears angled toward Emily without hostility, just assessment. Emily noticed and offered the dog a small nod. "Good sentinel," she said. Duke accepted the acknowledgement with dignified stillness. Jack asked the question he already knew the answer to. "Any advisories?" Emily exhaled. "Unofficially? Yes. Officially? We're still arguing over models. If it organizes the way it's hinting, the forest could see whiteout conditions and localized wind bursts strong enough to shear branches. Maybe worse." She hesitated, then added, "I'd recommend sheltering early." Jack glanced at the dome's ribs, now nearly complete, the curved geometry catching light differently as the sky paled. "We're close," he said. Emily studied him, then the structure, curiosity edging into respect. "That shape will help," she said carefully. "Curves shed force." Jack allowed himself a thin smile. "That's the idea." Emily shifted her weight. Decision made. "I'll loop back toward the trailhead and warn anyone still out. If this escalates, radio traffic might get messy." She met Jack's eyes. "You picked a hard place to build." Jack looked at Duke, then back at the ranger. "Hard places teach clearly." Emily nodded once and moved on, her snowshoes whispering away. The quiet returned, thicker now, pressing against Jack's ears. He checked the barometer again. Lower. Duke's nose lifted, drawing in air with short, precise sniffs. His ears flicked as if tracking something beyond hearing. Jack felt the familiar hum under his skin, the same prelude he'd felt before storms overseas, when radios crackled and the sky changed color. He tightened the final clamps on the upper ring and stepped back. Snow began to fall faster, flakes streaking now, losing their lazy hover. The sky's pale blue shifted toward green at the edges, a bruised tint Jack recognized from memory and hated for its accuracy. A vehicle's engine cut through the hush, climbing the trail with effort. A gray SUV pulled into the clearing and stopped. A woman stepped out, mid-50s, bundled in a thick parka, scarf wrapped high, glasses fogging briefly as she surveyed the sight. Dr. Linda Hayes moved with deliberate care, not from fear, but from calculation. She was average height, her build sturdy rather than soft, hair iron gray and cut short to avoid fuss. Her face bore lines from years of squinting at screens and skies, and her eyes, dark, alert, missed very little. She approached Jack, hand already extended. "Linda Hayes," she said. "I'm a meteorologist with the regional center. I've been following the anomalies." Jack shook her hand. "Jack Sullivan." Linda's gaze traveled up the dome, along the curves, then back to the sky. "You're reading it correctly," she said. "Surface pressure is collapsing faster than seasonal norms. Aloft, there's rotation weak but tightening. It's rare this time of year, but rare doesn't mean impossible." Duke sniffed Linda's boot, then stepped back, apparently satisfied. Linda noticed and smiled faintly. "He knows," she said. Jack didn't disagree. "What's your timeline?" he asked. Linda pursed her lips. "If it locks in, hours, not days." She tapped her tablet, scrolling through maps. "The worst part isn't the snow, it's the wind going quiet before it returns in bursts. People mistake the lull for safety." Jack's jaw tightened. He'd seen that mistake cost lives. He looked at the sky again, the greenish cast deepening, the clouds flattening and stacking like pages pressed together. "It's here," he said softly. Duke's ears snapped upright, a low sound rumbling in his chest, not a growl, but a warning note. Linda followed Jack's gaze and nodded. "Yes," she said, "it is." Snow began to fall sideways, then stopped abruptly, leaving an unnatural stillness that made the hairs on Jack's arms rise. The barometer needle dipped again. Jack moved quickly now, methodical rather than frantic. He secured the remaining joints, checked the door frame's curve, sealed gaps with practiced efficiency. Duke stayed glued to his side, occasionally breaking to stare into the trees, then returning, a living alarm system. Linda retreated to her vehicle, rolling down the window. "I'll file an urgent update," she called. "If you can, stay put. This structure finish it." "It may matter." Jack nodded. Emily's radio voice crackled faintly from somewhere beyond the trees, warnings overlapping with static. The forest held its breath. Snow resumed, harder, faster, the flakes smaller now, driven with intent. Jack stepped inside the dome's partial shell, testing the way sound changed, how the curve redirected it. It felt right. He glanced down at Duke. "You ready?" Duke met his eyes, steady, unblinking. The sky outside took on a deeper green-blue bruise, light flattening, shadows dissolving. Jack checked the barometer one last time. The needle had fallen to a mark he'd hoped never to see again in winter. "All right," he said, voice calm despite the tightening in his chest. "We brace." Duke shifted his stance, muscles engaged, ears forward. The quiet broke, not with a roar, but with absence, a vacuum of sound that pressed inward like hands against a chest. Jack closed his eyes for a second, grounding himself in the curve of wood, the warmth of fur at his leg, the certainty of preparation. When he opened them, snow streamed sideways again, and the forest beyond blurred into white. The message had been written clearly enough. The storm did not arrive gradually. It arrived like a slammed iron gate, the kind meant to separate the living from whatever came next. One moment, frost pine forest held its breath. The next, it exhaled violence. Wind struck sideways, then upward, then down again, confused and furious, as if searching for something solid enough to tear apart. Snow no longer fell, it was thrown, shredded into needles that hissed across the ground. Jack Sullivan pulled the curved door into place and dropped his shoulder against it just as the first true blast hit. The sound was not a howl, but a layered thunder, wood and air colliding, pressure stacking upon pressure until his teeth buzzed. Duke planted himself beside the door, broad chest braced, paws spread wide on the packed earth floor. At 7 years old, the German shepherd carried his weight like an anchor, muscles locked, scarred ear flattened against his head. His breathing was fast but controlled, eyes fixed on the seam where door met frame, as if daring the storm to try harder. Outside, the forest began to break. Jack heard the sharp crack of trees surrendering, the wet splinter of trunks twisting beyond their limits. Somewhere downslope, a rectangular hunting cabin one Jack had passed weeks earlier gave way with a sound like ribs snapping. Wind found its corners, pried them open, and peeled the structure apart, board by board. Jack flinched at the noise, a reflex he hated but accepted. "Easy," he muttered to himself as much as to Duke. He pressed his back against the curved wall and felt the difference immediately. Instead of a single point of impact, the force slid, distributed, wrapped around the structure, and moved on, frustrated. The dome shuddered, but it did not catch. The physics he had trusted in ink and memory now spoke in motion. Wind rushed over the smooth surface, split into streams, rejoined on the far side, robbed of leverage. Inside, the sound changed from an assault to a deep, continuous roar, like standing behind a waterfall, rather than beneath a collapsing roof. Snow forced its way through the smallest gaps, dusting the floor in fine white lines, but the structure held. Jack crouched lower, counting his breaths, grounding himself in the present. Duke leaned harder into the door, claws scraping slightly as the pressure reversed direction without warning. The wind god, if such a thing existed, was swinging wildly now, testing angles, striking from unexpected sides. Jack laughed once, sharp and shaky. "If we make it through this," he said over the noise, voice half swallowed by the roar, "I'm calling you Professor Duke." Duke flicked his eyes toward Jack, expression unreadable but unimpressed. His body did not move. The storm escalated. Gusts slammed into the north side, then abruptly shifted, hammering the west. The dome flexed, beams creaking but not cracking, joints absorbing force and releasing it like coiled springs. Jack felt pressure build in his ears, a painful squeeze that reminded him of explosions long past. He swallowed, equalized, forced his jaw to relax. Duke let out a low, steady growl, not fear, but effort. Each time the door bowed inward a fraction and then returned to true. Jack reached out and placed his hand on the dog's shoulder, fingers digging into thick fur. The contact steadied him more than any calculation. Outside, the world was being erased. Snow swirled so thickly that even sound seemed lost inside it, muffled and distorted. The rectangular shapes failed fastest. A supply shed near the trail collapsed inward, roof torn free and flung into the trees like a discarded lid. Jack pictured the wind hooking those corners, concentrating its rage where geometry had offered it purchase. Inside the dome, there were no corners to argue with, only curves to deflect, to confuse, to survive. The fire pit sputtered as pressure dropped again, embers flaring briefly before settling. Jack shielded it with his body, then checked the venting he'd designed into the lower curve small, angled openings meant to relieve internal pressure without inviting collapse. They worked. Air rushed out in controlled breaths instead of bursting through weak points. The storm screamed its disapproval. Hours or minutes, time had lost meaning past in that suspended violence. Jack's thighs burned from holding position. His shoulders ached from bracing, but he did not shift. Duke did not either. Once, a particularly savage gust hit, lifting the far edge of the dome just enough for Jack's heart to spike. The structure dropped back into place immediately, weight and shape reasserting dominance. Jack exhaled a laugh that bordered on hysteria. "Told you," he said hoarsely. "No corners." Duke's tail thumped once against the ground, the smallest sign of agreement. Gradually, the wind's rhythm changed. The blows lost their sharpness, stretching into longer, exhausted pushes. The roar lowered in pitch. Snow still drove sideways, but the pressure eased, then surged once more, then finally began to drain away like water after a flood. Jack stayed braced long after his instincts told him the worst had passed. Experience had taught him that storms lied. Duke remained locked in position, eyes never leaving the door. Only when the sound outside thinned to a ghost of itself did the dog finally ease back, muscles trembling from sustained effort. Jack sank onto the floor beside him, back against the curved wall, breath coming in ragged pulls. He pressed his forehead to Duke's neck and closed his eyes. "Good call, Professor," he murmured. The storm did not answer. Silence crept in cautiously, broken only by falling snow sliding off the dome's exterior in soft avalanches. Jack waited another full minute, then another, before reaching for the door latch. He opened it just enough to peer out. The world beyond was unrecognizable. Trees lay snapped like matchsticks. Drifts had sculpted new shapes where paths once ran. And yet the dome stood, scuffed, snow-lashed, but intact. Jack closed the door again and leaned back, a long, shaking breath leaving him. They were alive, because the wind had found nothing to grab. Morning arrived without ceremony. a pale light leaking through shredded clouds as if the sky were ashamed of what it had done. Frost Pine Forest looked flayed. Trees lay snapped and twisted, their broken ends pale against the snow like exposed bone. Drifts had hardened into slabs, sculpted by wind into sharp clawed ridges that cut paths where none existed before. Jack Sullivan opened the curved door slowly, bracing for another lie from the weather. But the air outside was still unnaturally so heavy with the aftermath of violence. Duke stepped out first, nose low, tail steady, his 7-year-old body moving with careful authority. He paused, scanning the ruin, then glanced back at Jack as if to say the worst had passed, but the work had not. Jack followed, boots crunching on refrozen snow, eyes cataloging damage with a soldier's habit. The dome stood behind him, scuffed and iced, but whole. Around it, the forest told a different story. Somewhere downslope, a cry cut through the quiet, thin, panicked human. Duke's head snapped up. He broke into a trot without waiting for a command, choosing a line through debris that Jack followed instinctively. They found the first survivor near the old trail marker, a middle-aged man with a gash across his forehead, sitting dazed against a fallen spruce. He introduced himself hoarsely as Mark Ellison, a seasonal guide with wind-burned skin and a beard gone wiry from neglect, eyes still unfocused from shock. Jack wrapped the man's head with clean cloth from his kit, checking pupils, speaking calmly until the shaking eased. Duke sat close, steady presence, the dog's warmth grounding the man's breathing. More voices followed, shouts, sobs, the sound of someone calling a name that did not answer. Jack moved with purpose now, triage mode engaged, directing those who could walk back toward the dome. The path became a procession of the shaken. Sarah Collins arrived next, face pale beneath her wool cap, blonde hair matted with snow, blue eyes bright with fear she did not try to hide. She was tall and slender, cheeks reddened raw by wind, hands trembling despite her efforts to keep them steady. "People are hurt," she said, voice tight. "Cabins? Gone." Jack nodded, already moving. At the dome, he turned the space into order. He stoked the fire, arranged blankets along the curved wall, set water to heat. Duke positioned himself at the doorway like a living hinge, letting people pass, watching each one with a measured, almost ceremonial seriousness. Then they brought in the child. Mia Parker was 8, small for her age, her dark hair tangled and rimed with ice, cheeks smudged with dirt and tears. She clutched a torn mitten and refused to let go, eyes darting for someone not there. "My mom," she whispered, voice barely sound. Jack knelt, lowering himself to her level, his lined face softening. "We'll find her," he said, not promising more than he could give, but meaning every word. Duke approached slowly, careful not to startle, and lay down so Mia could see his eyes. She reached out without looking, fingers curling into the thick fur at his neck. Her breathing slowed. They searched again. Near the creek bend, they found Tom Bennett pinned beneath a fallen trunk, his broad frame wedged awkwardly, breath shallow. Tom's mustache was caked with snow, his face gray with pain and fear stripped of bravado. Jack and Sarah worked together, leveraging the trunk with a pole, counting the lift. Duke barked once, sharp and directive, then planted himself to brace as the weight shifted. Tom gasped free and collapsed, shaking. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice breaking. "I laughed because I was scared." Jack didn't answer. He wrapped Tom in a blanket and helped him stand. Duke stepped forward and licked Tom's numb fingers, a small, deliberate gesture. Tom let out a breath that sounded like a laugh and a sob tangled together. Back at the dome, the shelter filled. Jack tended wounds, splinted an ankle, rationed food with practiced fairness. Emily Carter arrived by snowmobile, helmet tucked under her arm, dark braid loosened, eyes scanning with professional intensity that softened when she counted heads and realized how many had made it. Dr. Linda Hayes followed later, boots crunching, iron gray hair plastered by melt, glasses fogging as she stepped inside. She surveyed the curved walls, the unbroken joints, the survivors huddled safe, and nodded once, a scientist acknowledging data. "It held," she said simply. The dome became more than a structure. It became a truth none could deny. The people who had laughed now sat silent, absorbing the lesson written in broken timber outside and intact curves within. Mia slept curled against Duke's side, her small hand still fisted in fur. Sarah helped Jack rewrap bandages, her movements precise, her composure returning as purpose replaced fear. Tom sat near the fire, staring at the curve of the wall as if seeing it for the first time. Jack stood in the doorway, looking out at the scarred forest, feeling the weight of what had been spared and what had not. Duke returned to his side, pressed close, 4 steady legs anchoring the moment. There were no speeches, no triumph, only the quiet acceptance that the storm had judged them all, and geometry paired with loyalty had answered. Night returned to Frostpine Forest slowly, cautiously, as if afraid the wind might change its mind and come back for more. The moon rose thin and cold above the broken tree line, its light spilling across the snow in pale silver sheets. What the storm had not erased, moonlight revealed. Flattened clearings where cabins once stood, splintered beams frozen mid-fall, trails that ended abruptly in chaos. And at the center of it all, improbably whole, stood Jack Sullivan's dome, its curved skin glazed with ice, glowing faintly like a quiet answer to violence. Duke lay near the entrance, his large frame stretched out but alert, amber eyes reflecting the moon whenever he lifted his head. The dog's black and tan coat was dusted with snow, one ear still nicked from old service injuries, his breathing slow but vigilant. He had not truly rested since the storm passed. Inside the dome, survivors slept in uneven rhythms. Some murmured in dreams, others jolted awake at every creak of cooling wood. Sarah Collins sat with her back against the wall, knees drawn up, a blanket wrapped tightly around her slender frame. Her blonde hair, usually neat, had slipped loose and fell over her shoulders in soft, tangled waves. Moonlight caught the faint freckles across her pale skin. She looked exhausted but composed, the way people do when fear has burned itself out and left behind resolve. Across the fire pit, Tom Bennett stared into the embers. In the calmer light, the man looked older than Jack remembered. Broad shoulders slumped, thick fingers bandaged, mustache damp with melted snow. He had always been loud, dismissive, quick with jokes that covered his unease. Tonight, silence sat on him like a second coat. Jack moved quietly among them, checking blankets, adding wood to the fire, adjusting vents so the air remained steady. His face, lined by years of cold nights and older wars, looked carved rather than tired. He had shaved his beard days ago out of habit, leaving sharp angles along his jaw that contrasted with the gentle curves of the shelter around him. When he stepped outside for a moment, Duke rose immediately and followed, padding close to Jack's left side as if the position were fixed by law. The forest was eerily still. Snow no longer hissed or shifted. It lay locked in place, sculpted by what had passed. Jack tilted his head, listening. Not for danger, but for confirmation. Nothing. Just the faint crackle of ice settling, the slow breath of night. "We held," he murmured, more to himself than to the dog. Duke bumped his leg once, solid and warm, a wordless reply. Headlights appeared far down the forest road, bouncing unevenly over debris. The sound of engines followed, muted, careful. Rescue teams arrived in clusters. County responders first, then a state emergency unit. Men and women stepped out bundled in reflective jackets, boots crunching, radios crackling with disbelief. One of them, a tall man with a graying beard and sharp eyes, stopped short when he saw the dome. "That thing, still standing?" he asked aloud, not really to anyone. Dr. Linda Hayes emerged from behind a vehicle, her posture straight despite fatigue, iron-gray hair tucked beneath a knit cap. She adjusted her glasses and walked slowly around the structure, hand hovering inches from the curved wall as if touching it required permission. "Low profile," she said thoughtfully. "Continuous curvature. no stress concentration points. She looked at Jack then, studying him with new attention. "You designed this yourself?" Jack nodded once. "I followed the math," he said simply. Linda smiled. Not the indulgent smile people gave amateurs, but the quiet one scientists reserved for results they respected. Emily Carter coordinated the evacuation, her ranger uniform marked with snow and ash. She spoke firmly but kindly, assigning rides, checking names. When she reached Jack, she paused. "You saved lives today," she said, meeting his eyes. Jack shook his head. "Physics did," he replied. Emily glanced at Duke, who sat calmly at Jack's side, posture proud but relaxed. "And that dog," she added. Duke's tail thumped once, restrained, professional. By the time the last injured were loaded and the forest road fell quiet again, the dome remained occupied by only a handful, those with nowhere else to go until morning. Mia Parker slept curled beside Duke, her small back rising and falling against his flank, fingers still tangled in his fur. Her mother had been found alive but injured, taken ahead for treatment. Jack watched the child sleep and felt something unclench in his chest. Near midnight, Tom approached Jack hesitantly. In the moonlight, his eyes looked softer, stripped of bravado. "I spent my life thinking strength meant hard edges," he said, voice low. "Turns out, corners break." Jack studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "They do," he agreed. Dawn came clean and cold. Under the rising light, the full truth was impossible to ignore. Where cabins had once stood in neat, square confidence, only scars remained. The dome stood alone, unmarred, snow sliding easily from its surface as sunlight warmed it. People gathered around it instinctively, hands brushing the curved wall, expressions caught between grief and awe. A woman with dark hair streaked prematurely gray whispered, "It's like it refused to fight the storm." Jack overheard and answered without turning. "It didn't refuse," he said. "It redirected." Over the next hours, talk changed tone. No one laughed now. Questions replaced mockery. Could it be built again? Could others learn? Jack listened more than he spoke. When pressed, he explained without flourish. Curved walls to distribute force, low height to reduce leverage, continuous joints, flexible connections. "It's not magic," he repeated. "It's cooperation with the wind, not against it." As the sun climbed, Duke lay in the snow outside, eyes half closed, finally resting. Frost clung to his whiskers. He looked peaceful, older than his years, carrying the quiet dignity of something that had done exactly what it was meant to do. Jack sat beside him, back against the dome, and for the first time in a long while allowed himself to imagine a future that stayed. Not running from storms, but teaching others how to let them pass. In the quiet after the storm, when the snow settles and the wind finally loosens its grip, some will call what happened a miracle. Others will call it preparation, or science, or luck. But perhaps the truth is simpler and deeper. Perhaps God whispers long before he shouts. Perhaps he places knowledge in a weary soldier's hands, loyalty in a dog's heart, and patience in a design that bends instead of breaks. Perhaps the miracle is not that the storm spared one small dome, but that someone listened when wisdom arrived quietly, wrapped in humility and faith. In our daily lives, storms come too, not always with snow and wind, but with loss, fear, loneliness, and doubt. And we are often tempted to build our lives with sharp corners, pride, anger, stubbornness, thinking strength means resistance. Yet time and again, life teaches us what the storm taught this valley, what bends with love, endures. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to reflect on where you might soften a corner in your own life, where you might listen more closely, where you might trust that God is guiding you even when the sky looks uncertain. Please share this story with someone who needs hope tonight. Leave a comment below Amen if you believe, or simply a word from your heart. And if you haven't already, subscribe to the channel so you won't miss more stories of courage, loyalty, faith, and quiet miracles. May God bless you, protect you, and keep you warm through every storm you face. Wherever you are watching from, you are not alone, and you are part of this story.